There's been a lot of talk about social media lately, so I'm actually here to talk about the original social media, beer. For the past 10,000 years, with maybe the exception of about 1933 to about 1990 in this country when the big brewers sort of took over and tried to ruin the whole thing, beer has been about community. Small breweries, very community focused, that's what beer has always been about. This has been the driving force behind St. Arnold's, and really it's what drew me into beer and into home brewing, and from home brewing into professional brewing. That and the fact that I love beer. Before I get into my whole history, I'd like to give you a quick lesson on civilization. Beer is the basis of civilization. So I'm not making this up. This is a leading archaeological theory that says that about 10,000 years ago there were a couple hunters and gatherers out hunting, gathering some wild barley seed, mushing it together, making this kind of crude loaf of bread, barley soup. We're not exactly sure what it was, but it didn't turn out real well. It's a couple dudes. They went out, they hunted, they gathered, they killed a woolly mammoth and a saber tooth and ate that. Don't worry about my historical accuracy on that. But they did that for a couple weeks, and then they came back to their campsite, and they were tired, and they were hungry, and they were thirsty, and it had rained a lot while they were gone, and that bowl of barley goo had now turned into this watery barley juice, and probably had a weird foamy crust on top of it. And they looked at each other and said, "You thirsty?" "Yep." Remember, there's a couple dudes we're talking about. Said, "Let's drink it." So they start drinking it. And it probably didn't taste all that great, but they looked at each other at the end and said, "Hey, I feel pretty good. How about you?" The other one said, "You're cute." And with that, beer was born, and people had to settle down and form agrarian communities to cultivate barley. And that is why we're civilized. And in fact, when archaeologists find, I'm not making this up, when archaeologists find evidence of a beer-making culture and a wine-making culture, they actually decreed that the beer-making culture was more advanced because it took more social structure to make beer than wine. So that's why we call wine drinkers cork dorks. My cousin has a winery. Wine, alcohol runs in my family in many different ways. I tell him that we're more advanced. He says, "Yeah, when did you sell a bottle of your beer for $75?" So we're working on that. Anyway, I grew up in Cincinnati and in Brussels, Belgium. I was a Procter & Gamble child. And both, interestingly, are historical brewing centers. It really wasn't until high school, though, that I started becoming interested in beer. And that was when my dad and I would go play tennis, and then afterwards he'd split a bottle of beer with me. And our local brewery in Cincinnati, Hudipole, had come out with this new beer called Christian Moerlein. And they marketed it with this crazy thing. They said that it was the first beer brewed in this country that was brewed according to the old German beer purity law, the Reinheitsgebot, which was the beer purity law of 1516, which stated that you could only use 4 ingredients in your beer: malt, hops, yeast, and water. And this is kind of a crazy concept in the 70s because brewers were using, of course, the big stuff like rice and corn in their beer to make it lighter and make it cheaper. But they're also using all sorts of other additives and preservatives. Beer is exempt from federal labeling laws, so you get a Hostess Twinkie, you can look on it and see exactly what's in it. God help you if you still eat it. But beer, you don't have to list what's in there, and in fact, you can just list the nice ingredients. So anyway, so this beer, Christian Moerlein, it was the first beer I'd ever had that, because I was always, from a very early age, I would have a sip of beer, but this is the first beer that really kind of turned me on. It's like, this is good stuff. When I went to college, I went to Rice here in Houston, and that's where I discovered home brewing. The RA in my dorm taught me how to home brew. This was not, by the way, condoned by the university. This in turn led me to running a pub out of my dorm room my senior year. Also not condoned by the university. And friends would stop by, they'd have a beer. and pretty soon, lots of people were stopping by. If they were annoying, I would raise the price of the beer. I was an economics major, so I learned this. Really what I found was, I quickly discovered the community that immediately forms around beer. My goal since high school was to have my own company. I always knew I wanted to be an entrepreneur, own my own company. And originally I thought the purpose was to make money. This is the 1980s, and it was all about making money, leverage buyouts, greed is good. And in fact, after I graduated from college, my first career, I spent 7 years in investment banking during the heyday of investment banking back then. And I got to watch value systems get corrupted, and all the things that we're seeing right now were things that I witnessed on a daily basis in my old job. During this period, I realized that money did not get me out of bed in the morning. It was not what I was about. And the epiphany really came during Thanksgiving of 1992. My grandfather had just passed away. I was up at their house in Northern California. And my grandfather was given to many philosophical speeches about the meaning of life. And I was a dutiful grandson. I used to always sit there and listen to him, which also made everybody else in the family happy because they didn't have to. But one of the things he talked about was how he considered himself to be one of the luckiest men in the world because he had loved his work every day of his life. So I started thinking about that and thought, well, what do I love? Well, beer. So I quit my job in, it was January 1993. I think it was January 8th. Bonuses were paid on January 7th. And I opened St. Arnold in 1994. Our mission statement was, and still is, to brew and sell the best beer in Texas. I define that as make a world-class beer and get it to people as fresh as possible, because beer is all about freshness. And then the other part was create an institution that Houston is proud of. Sometimes I define that today as make Houston a better place to live. But really at the start, our singular focus was brewing beer. We needed to get up off the ground. Being a self-taught home brewer, I realized I had a lot to learn, and that scaling up to commercial production was going to be a whole lot more complicated than just making a little batch of home brew. I read pretty much every brewing text I could get my hands on. But really the best resource was the community of craft brewers. I would call the other craft brewers that had, most of them had just opened. The first craft breweries opened in this country around 1980. By 1992, when I was starting work on this, there were about 100 craft breweries. And I went around and visited about a quarter of them. And I was amazed. These guys were incredibly busy, but they would take lots of time out of their day to visit with me, take a couple hours and show me their brewery and I had this big list of questions. I would come in and I would ask them, who to get equipment from, what kind of equipment to use, what things would you do differently, lots of technical questions, and they would just give me wonderful answers. Then I'd ask them, well, how do you sell your beer? What do you do to market it? And I would just get these blank stares. Sell? I says, well, a truck backs up to our dock. We load it up with our beer, the truck goes off. Next day the truck's back. What are you talking about? Well, most of these breweries had opened up in the Northwest, Seattle, Oregon, Northern California, and these brewers were all blessed with being in a market where demand way outstripped supply. We opened in Texas. We were not troubled with this excess demand issue. So we actually had to work on trying to sell our beer.